If we've witnessed the rise of humanitarian warfare conducted over the human, such ends have been accompanied by an attempt to humanize the means of war, which is to say to remove from war cruelty and risk, perhaps even death itself. And we can see this through the emergence of what became two dominant norms of Western warfare by the early 1990s. A norm of casualty aversion and a norm of civilian protection. To talk of the first, we could note that humanitarian war, of course, is justified with the grandest of moral language. We're waging war in the name of humanity, in defense of human rights. And yet, paradoxically, the more a military intervention is justified on humanitarian grounds, the less tolerant to casualties among the armed forces Western domestic audiences seem to be. Particularly significant of this phenomenon is the Battle of Mogadishu of October 1993 that took place in the context of a UN mission in Somalia that was led by the United States. In an exchange that saw US military forces ambushed in the city of Mogadishu, 18 Marines were killed. In contrast, about 500 Somali fighters perished. And the aftermath of the death of those 18 Marines was eventually a withdrawal of the US from Somalia in 1994. This event was very widely reported at the time, and the perception of it certainly was that American public opinion very quickly lost support for the intervention and withdrawal became unavoidable. Policymakers were very marked by that experience, and it gave rise to what became known as the body bag syndrome. The idea that in interventions, if too many military casualties are incurred, if too many body bags are seen, then this will fatally undermine the intervention. It's worth noting that in the 1990s, we also witnessed a moment in which riskless and casualty-free war appeared to be a possibility. If we look at the Gulf War of 1991, we saw a conflict in which many commentators prior to it expected a large-scale loss of life among coalition fighters. Instead, only 148 US military personnel lost their lives. In fact, the rate of fatality was so low in that conflict that it was lower than the mortality rate of the US civilian population, which is to say that soldiers engaged in the Gulf War found their lives less at risk than if they'd stayed in the United States. This would be followed in the Kosovo War of 1999, a strictly aerial campaign with a conflict in which no NATO soldiers, combatants, lost their lives. So something clearly was happening at this time, one that was grounded in large part in technology, in the dominance of American/Western technology, particularly in the area of precision bombing and aerial supremacy, which appeared to make the waging of war at almost no cost to human life a possibility. Again, to just draw that contrast again, during the Vietnam War, the US Air Force lost in total 1,737 planes in combat. From the 1991 Gulf War onwards to present day, the United States has lost only 22 planes. So a very radical change in terms of the vulnerability of weapon platforms in the wars that the West at least has chosen to fight. So this, in a sense, established a new expectation, both within military planners, but also within the civilian population, perhaps more significantly, that war could be waged without casualties, and in effect making also casualties more unbearable. Simultaneously, humanitarian wars are expected to conform to a higher standard of moral conduct in the exercise of force. Humanitarian wars must limit civilian casualties, must target only the so-called bad guys. Indeed, it's difficult to not see the way in which a humanitarian intervention quickly becomes a jarring contradiction when it states as its aims to reduce human suffering, and then it results in greater human suffering. So the imperative to conduct operations in such a way that they spare civilians as much as possible became a major constraint for militaries engaging in humanitarian intervention, and has become more generally part of the Western way of war today. So, in sum, there is a dual imperative here. An imperative to reduce risk and loss of life to intervening forces, and an imperative to make war as discriminate as possible and avoid as much as it can be possible so-called collateral damage, loss of life of civilians and bystanders. So that after coffee without caffeine and beer without alcohol, we have war without killing, or at least, supposedly, the moral dilemmas inherent to it. And of course, technology here plays the crucial role, because it appears to promise the means of more precise, clean, and humane wars. Whether it's the precision-guided munitions that promise surgical strikes and decapitation strikes that will only hit at the enemy and spare the civilian, or whether it is non-lethal weapons, be they chemical, electrical, biological, kinetic, acoustic, an array of weapon systems that have been developed that are designed to neutralize, immobilize, incapacitate, but not kill. Which of course is all the more attractive in environments where civilians and combatants mix, and where policing and warfighting blend. Finally, we have the rise of unmanned aerial vehicles, or robotics more general, with the increasing deployment in the field of semi-autonomous or fully autonomous systems that can put human operators either at a great distance or simply completely out of the picture. I encourage you to pause the video now to briefly watch the accompanying clip drawn from the Iron Man film of 2008, because the scene that is depicted in that clip is in some ways a perfect encapsulation of the technological fantasy of humanitarian military intervention, the dream of a technological supremacy that can assuredly only take out the bad guys and spare the lives of the civilians we are intervening in for. Again, the Kosovo War is a very important part of this story. And I can't go into all the details of that conflict. If you're not familiar with the background of it, I encourage you to read it up, because in some ways the archetypal humanitarian intervention perceived as a great success and the template for subsequent interventions. It was, as I've already stated, entirely an aerial campaign presented by the US Secretary of Defense at the time as the most precise and lowest collateral damage air campaign in history, with claims of about 500 civilians killed. The Supreme Allied Commander for NATO at the time, Wesley Clark, stated that the Kosovo War was the only air campaign in history in which lovers strolled down riverbanks in the gathering twilight and ate at outdoor cafes and watched the fireworks. You almost want to be there. But humane warfare raises a number of problematic issues of both a practical and ethical nature. From a purely utilitarian perspective, it's not clear that the minimization of risk always achieves the best overall outcome. In fact, if we revisit the Kosovo War, we realize that the success that is claimed is more ambiguous than it appears at first. Some of the subsequent reports conducted by the US military itself found that the initial reports it had made of successful strikes were vastly inflated. It had claimed to have destroyed 120 tanks, but only the remains of 14 tanks could be found. It had claimed to have destroyed 450 artillery pieces, and yet only 20 could then be recovered. So it appeared that on the first instance, on the first place, that the precision of these weapons was much less than had been thought. Moreover, the obsession over Allied casualties that the Allied forces displayed was an asset in some ways to the Serb opposition, particularly the leader of the Yugoslav government, Milosevic, because the United States and therefore NATO made very clear early on that a ground offensive would not happen, largely because of the risk of loss of life and the lack of support in US public opinion. But in doing so, the NATO intervening forces restrained themselves, and the consequences of that could have been to drag out the war and cause more casualties down the line. Certainly, Clausewitz believed war could not be anything else but bloody slaughter, and that well-meaning attempts to avert this were pointless and dangerously counterproductive. Finally, when we actually look at the Kosovo War, we can see that the bombing had a relatively low impact on the ethnic cleansing it was designed to arrest. In fact, the ethnic cleansing increased with bombing. So it is legitimate to ask whether the Kosovo War was such an unmitigated success, and to what extent the Allies turned out to be quite fortunate in the outcome of that conflict. Certainly, subsequent interventions have proven to be less obviously successful. But there is a further problem here. The problem is that in practice, the twin objectives of reducing risk to both military and civilians are frequently contradictory. For instance, if one wants to reduce the risk to pilots, you can order them to fly at high altitudes, putting them at greater distance from anti-aircraft defenses. But of course, the more distant, the higher up in the air you bomb, the more there's a probability of civilian casualties, the more imprecise the bombing is likely to be. On the other hand, if you want to reduce civilian casualties and bomb closer to the ground, airplanes are likely to expose themselves to a greater extent to fire and therefore to risk. Now, this is just an example, but effectively it illustrates the point that there is a trade-off between military and civilian risk, that you cannot privilege both of them at the same time, that a trade-off has to be established. And when we look at that trade-off in practice, in those interventions that have been conducted, it's very clear that states prosecuting humanitarian wars have systematically privileged the protection of military lives over civilian ones. So rather than riskless war, Martin Shaw prefers to speak of risk transfer war, in which risk is transferred from military personnel to civilians. And the manifestation of this is in repeated small massacres of civilians. Shaw says that these repeated small massacres are an understood feature of the new Western way of war. These are only accidental in the sense that they are not specifically intended, and reasonable efforts are made to avoid them. We are not in the case of what Shaw calls elsewhere degenerate war. There isn't an attempt to target civilians deliberately, but nonetheless the risk is understood as a likely incident that is programmed into the risk analysis of war. And so to speak of them as accidents, when for instance a wedding party is bombed, or children playing in a field are mistaken for laying IEDs and therefore targeted by a drone, these are not so much accidents, but results of a predictable choice in terms of the distribution of risks that are made in a military intervention. Similarly, when we consider the targeting of infrastructure that has become a very significant part of Western aerial strategy, targeting the energy or water or transport infrastructure, these are seen as ways to bring a regime down without taking immediate loss of life. But of course, the disruption of infrastructure can have much lasting effects on the living conditions of affected populations. And so when we think about the toll of bombing or military intervention, we also have to consider the indirect effects that these interventions take. Bombs may not be dropped on civilians, but they may have effects that will eventually cost the lives or undermine the living conditions of civilians. So riskless war is perhaps rather more risk-free for intervening soldiers than civilians. Now, it's possible, of course, to argue that, regrettable as it may be, such a trade-off is the price of intervention in external conflicts. If we deem these interventions necessary and just, well, it may well be that we have no choice other than to have this very asymmetrical distribution of risk, because that's the conditions under which we can get public opinion to support intervention. And that a flawed intervention is still better than no intervention at all. That the saving of a great number of lives overall is the ultimate justification. But is there perhaps a deeper ethical peril to what Edward Ludwig called post-heroic warfare? A unwillingness to risk military lives while intervening in the name of grand moral principles. Perhaps the most profound question is whether there can be any true ethical commitment that entails no cost or sacrifice. Are we not in the presence of what Zygmunt Bauman speaks of when he refers to carnivals of charity, those events in which citizens of developed countries punctually engage, where they participate in tokenistic public demonstrations of sensitivity to the plight of the poor or downtrodden, but make no changes that would come at any real cost or significant burden to their lifestyles. Here we have a slide of a Make Poverty History wristband. Some of you may remember when we all went to listen to rock music and abolished poverty. Those were the days. Paul Kahn points out that riskless warfare in the pursuit of human rights is nothing short of a moral contradiction. Because human rights assumes that all human life is of equal value. And yet, risk-free warfare presumes that some lives matter more than those. In other words, the lives of those who intervene are more valuable than those in the name of whom they intervene. Kahn points out that the right to intervene in the affairs of other communities is never clear. We're back to this old universal versus communitarian debate. There is no clear way to dissolve that philosophical divide. One can take a particular option or express a preference for one view or another, but both these positions cannot be, this divide cannot be overcome through mere logical argument. They are really different starting positions. And Kant therefore says that we can only legitimately intervene if we make the suffering of others our own, if we forge a new community with them, if we make concrete and real this humanity that we invoke when we talk of human rights and when we conduct humanitarian intervention. But the reluctance to risk military casualties implicitly conveys the message that the lives of military personnel are of greater value than the lives of those they are purportedly intervening in favour of. And so the greatest ethical inconsistency of humanitarian intervention may therefore not so much be the irregularity of its application, the fact that in some cases we have humanitarian intervention and in others we don't, but rather in the unwillingness to pursue such interventions in a manner that makes tangible the claims of shared community invoked to legitimize them. But perhaps all this is moot, because there are reasons to think that humane warfare will have a short life. There is, after all, a very obvious strategic response for the adversaries of Western militaries who see these militaries as being intent on humanizing war. That response is to exploit this aversion to casualties. The Somali warlord General Aidid was acutely aware of the humanizing constraints on the US forces all the way back into 1993. Aidid stated that if you kill just one American, they will go away. Well, he wasn't quite right. You had to kill 18 Americans. But when you did, they did go away. And Aidid indeed deliberately sought to inflict intolerable casualties on American forces and increase the likelihood of and the publicity surrounding civilian deaths. So for certainly ruthless and canny adversaries, the attempt to humanize war within Western militaries can be counteracted by exploiting this trade-off between the goals of casualty aversion and civilian protection. One of the most common tactics, for instance, employed in asymmetric wars is the use of civilian populations and infrastructures, such as schools or hospitals, as cover or shields, human shields for combatants to protect themselves. In doing so, they present Western forces with thorny dilemmas. Either they target these installations and take the risk of causing civilian casualties, or they have to refrain to do so and provide immunity from attack to those groups. In other words, the strategic response to an adversary that seeks to humanize war is quite simply to make it as inhumane as possible. And until Western militaries can convince lesser military powers, weaker adversaries, that they should also adopt a mode of humane warfare, one in which Western militaries have all the advantages, then they will very likely encounter persistently adversaries that go the other way, that will try to make war as bloody, as messy, as barbaric as possible.